last session, we saw the huge chasm between the movement that Jesus started on the day of Pentecost versus what we do now in what we call church. And we saw that there were no clergy, no buildings, and no liturgy. So what I'd like to do now is move the focus in a bit to how did this early church, spirit-led movement, how did they express themselves when they came together? In other words, what kind of meeting did they have? We know they had them, and the New Testament talks about the saints assembling together. So what was the nature of what happened? And we don't have a lot of information in the New Testament about that, but we do have one window into a meeting of the body. And the only reason we know anything about it is because there was some problems that Paul was addressing. And so we're going to take a look at 1 Corinthians 14, where we have Paul sort of describing what was going on in Corinth, and then giving some response to some of the aberrations that were taking place. But before we get to that, I just wanted to read this statement by Jon Zens, where he talks about going back to what I said earlier in another session on the well, the rivers of living water that reside in each believer and can flow forth with Christ. And so Zens says, what people do not always know is that they have a well deep inside of them. If that well is tapped, springs of life and tenderness flow forth. It has to be revealed to each person that these waters are there and that they can rise up from each one of us and flow over people, giving them life and new hope. So here's this echo of the living waters in each believer. And as I said in other sessions, unfortunately, it appears that these flowing rivers of Jesus that reside in each believer are often untapped because of the nature of the religious structures and the way things are done. And so just a few people end up expressing things, and the most people are just silent, and nothing ever comes out of them. They aren't able to share Christ at the table. And so what Zens says here is that every person has a well within them, and we need to pray that the Lord will open the wells and let the flowing water of Christ come forth when the saints come together. And so we have in 1 Corinthians 14 a little window of a meeting, and the kind of meeting they had. And the evidence in the New Testament is scanty about the meetings of the believers, but what we can tell, as I pointed out in the previous session, is they met house to house, breaking bread. They had joy of heart together, and we know that they didn't have church buildings. They basically were meeting in an informal setting in different homes. And in the first century, of course, there were a few people. Some people had more means, and so they were able to open their homes for the body and have them come in. And of course, some people, like slaves, wouldn't have much, of a domicile, and so it'd probably be hard to meet in their living quarters. But some people had larger homes, and so they allowed the brothers and sisters to come into their places and have times together. So what we see in 1 Corinthians 14 is first of all, there's no up front. So it isn't like, people are sitting in rows and then they're looking up to a platform or something with a pulpit and a worship band or something. There's nothing of that. It's just people gathering together in an informal setting, and they're just there. There's no up front, and so that's quite striking. Secondly, there's nobody leading the meeting. Well, I say nobody. Of course, there's somebody leading it, and that's Jesus. But there was no human leaders were not leading it, and so the meeting was pretty much an open, participatory kind of gathering. And obviously this has its potential problems. It has risks. It's a very vulnerable way to meet. But Paul didn't squash the meeting way, the way they were meeting. He was addressing the different issues of concern. But he never said, let's stop doing this and let's start having a more rigid service. No, he never said that. But anyway, so there's no platform, there's no up front, there's no leaders that are leading what's going on. It's a spirit-led meeting. And so what you find is you have different people speaking. So one is maybe standing up, another one, he sits down, another person stands up. So it's just sort of a free-flowing gathering is the feeling you get when you read that passage. Now the problem was, of course, that the Corinthians were focusing a bit too much on the outward gift of tongues, and there were some issues there. So he's correcting that. But in the process of correcting it, he doesn't say, let's stop having an open meeting and let's have a meeting led by a few people and all that. No, he encourages them to keep doing what they're doing. But what does he say? In verse 26, he says, each one of you has a song, a teaching, a hymn, a tongue, an interpretation. Let all things be done unto edifying or building up. So Paul has no problem with each person sharing what is on their heart. He just encourages them. His rule, if you will, is let everything that's done be edifying. Let everything be building up. And we know that the way that would happen is if Christ is being expressed through each person who's sharing in the meeting. And so here's a gathering of saints in Corinth. Most of them come from a pagan background, some of them from a synagogue, and they're all together there in someone's home, and there you have it. And so we have a meeting of saints. They had no doubt, it seems they had the Lord's Supper in connection with that, a meal together, and they however the Spirit led, they went for it. So this is quite different, of course, from the way we do church now. So now we have what we call a church service, which there's nothing about a church service in the New Testament. But now we have a church service where people come to a building, they sit in rows, they're facing forward to a platform and a pulpit, and then you have the few people up front who guide the meeting and preach in the meeting and sing in the meeting. And all the people basically do are maybe put some money in the plate when it goes by, and then they sing some songs out of a hymnal, and that's pretty much it. Now, of course, there are other positions that people can fill, like being an usher or being a Sunday school teacher or things like that. But the point is they're not openly participating in the gathering of the saints where they're sharing Christ with one another. This was driven home to me a couple of months ago, and Dottie and I went to a traditional church for the sake of a friend of ours. And we were sitting in the very, very back row. And there were about 100 people there that morning, and then the pastor was up front. And as I was just sitting there, looking at what was in front of me, my heart was just really grieved. Because here are roughly 100 people, many of them over 50. These people have portions of Christ that would be so valuable to hear and share with one another. But what do we have instead? We have 100 people listening to one person who's standing up front. Now the sermon that morning, I would have to say, as sermons go, was superb. It was really good. But no matter how good it was, there's something wrong about it, because it's pointing to one person. And he's the only person that functions, really. The rest of them are just ears to listen to a monologue. And so my heart was just really grieved, because that's the first time I'd been in a traditional service for a long time. But anyway, my point is, you see, that here's a group of people that have something of Christ to share, but there's no opportunity for it. It's stifled, it's squelched, and silenced. And I'm submitting to you that in light of 1 Corinthians 14, that's wrong. Why don't we have open meetings? Why don't we let the brothers and sisters share Christ with each other as the Spirit leads? Now, a couple of answers I've heard over the years would be like, well, gee, if you do that, somebody's going to say something that's heretical or way out of line. Well, yeah, that's true. But the point being is that if a body has been learned some things about functioning together, when that happens, they can respond to it. It's not the end of the world. I've seen it myself, how that works. The body can be self-correcting. If somebody says something that's way out of line, the brothers and sisters, I've seen it, they come in gently and lovingly, and they interact and correct, and maybe tell the person, maybe there's other ways to look at that, all that. But the point being, the fact that something goofy might be said is not a reason to cancel, the open meeting. The other thing I've heard is, same people will speak every time you get together. Well, that is a problem, but you know what? Again, if people are learning some things about meeting together, then that's not going to be a problem, because they'll learn that we're supposed to be swift to hear and slow to speak, and we should be willing to listen to other people and not be talkative and dominating. That we should want to be listeners mostly to others rather than speakers. So another problem mentioned is that it's too risky, it's too vulnerable, it doesn't have any order. That's a concern. Well, that could be true, but here again, the early church was Spirit-led. The early church did not have everything in a bulletin. The early church was, you might say, a keg of dynamite, and it wasn't all in a box. So sure, living by the Spirit is risky and vulnerable and has risks. But to me, I've seen it so many times, it's so beautiful. It's revealed here in 1 Corinthians 14 that this is the general way that they met, was an open gathering for Christ to be expressed. Now, in light of this, I have a serious question to ask you and myself, and that is, as I mentioned in the last session a bit, why is it that when we come to a passage like 1 Corinthians 14, that basically it appears that church leaders just sort of skip over it, or take scissors and cut it out of their New Testament, or they just don't avoid it, or they don't want to look at it? But the bottom line is 1 Corinthians 14, apparently, according to the way we do church, is irrelevant. It has no point. It has no reason for us to investigate it. If maybe there's something there we're missing, it's just basically consigned to oblivion. And I want to suggest that that's a dangerous way to go. Why do we say, if the Bible tells me, to be swift to hear and slow to speak and be humble and open, and I take that seriously and I want the Lord to work those things in me, but then when it comes to something like 1 Corinthians 14 about church life, then suddenly, doesn't make any difference. We're pretty free. We can do church as we like, that kind of thing. So we have a very flippant attitude when it comes to the revelation of the ecclesia in the New Testament, but we claim to have a more stricter concern when it comes to the New Testament speaking to our hearts. My question is, why do we make that bifurcation? Why do we divide into church life and personal life? That doesn't make any sense to me. If 1 Corinthians 14 is relevant, if it is part of the revelation of Christ, why do we skip over it? Why do we avoid it? Why do we not practice it? And that's a serious question. And of course, the ramifications of this are a pebble thrown in a lake, and the ripples start going out. Because obviously that would mean that our traditional view of pastor would have to be completely reevaluated, because now we're talking about an open meeting where you don't have human leaders. You let the Lord lead through the Spirit in each brother and sister. And so this is the burden of my heart. It just aches all the time about this, is why the revelation in 1 Corinthians 14 is avoided. There's no concern about it. And I think I know partially why, because the system that has been created doesn't have any room for 1 Corinthians 14. And if 1 Corinthians 14 became important and was being examined maybe for some things to learn, then it would threaten the whole system. The whole thing would have to fall apart. Because now you're talking about a gathering of saints around Jesus Christ where it's, to be, just put it bluntly, it's wide open. There's no restrictions. There's no predetermined thing. There's no bulletin. It's just coming together and trusting Him to lead the meeting. Now, Paul does say, let everything be done decently and in order, and make sure everything is edifying. But even with those two statements, that doesn't mean that you can't have a free-flowing, Spirit-led gathering that can be very edifying and uplifting, where Christ can be exalted and lifted up among the saints. And so when of course people have many fears about a gathering like 1 Corinthians 14. Why? Because all the traditions of men have squeezed 1 Corinthians 14 out of the picture, so people are afraid of it. They've never seen it done. They have no model except the pew, pulpit, platform, worship band scenario. That's all they know. So when you start talking about having an open meeting, they're scared. And I don't blame them. I mean, it is scary. But the point is, look at the blessing we're missing. If it's the will of Christ for us to gather as equal saints around the Lord Jesus Christ, why do we see the blessing we're missing? This is such a wonderful occurrence when it is allowed to come to pass, when people come together under His lordship and ask Him to guide the gathering and ask Him to speak through the brothers and sisters. That is a wonderful experience, and I can testify to that. But most people have never had a model. They've never seen anything like that. And maybe they heard about something, a rumor or something, and that it was awful or chaotic. But the point being, regardless of the rumors, if 1 Corinthians 14 has something to say to us, are we going to listen? Are we going to consider that perhaps the whole way we've constructed a religious service is incorrect, and that we need to jettison it and abandon it and ask Christ to show us how He wants us to meet together under Him, to let Him guide the gathering? And the blessings that would accrue with such an approach would be staggering. To have the saints come together in freedom and express the Lord Jesus. Then going back to that church service I went to where the 100 people were silent and the pastor was the only one speaking. Just think if those 100 people, perhaps 100, it would be a tougher meeting to manage, but that's not the point. What if you open that up where the pastor was just away, he wasn't the center, and you open it up to all those people and just ask them, is the Lord giving you something, a portion of Him to share with us today, and just let and see what happens? My guess is you'd be shocked at the beautiful things that would come forth from the saints when they were given opportunity to share what's on their hearts. And yes, there could be problems, but the problems do not cancel out the blessing of having a Christ-centered gathering where people can speak the Lord to one another in songs, hymns, and spiritual songs, and everything else that can take place. So I'd encourage you to think about that. Is 1 Corinthians 14 relevant or not? Is there maybe perhaps a way that we're missing the blessing of the Lord because we've put Him in a box in a church building and in a bulletin, and we're not really letting the Spirit flow through the body of Christ? I think we just find tremendous blessing if we were to rethink this whole thing and basically jettison the church service and see what the Lord would lead us to do.